Hello, my name is Sara Barnard and I am a YA author, and I'm here today to talk about hope and authenticity in storytelling. And the reason I want to talk about that and the reason I chose that topic is because I think they are interconnected, hope and authenticity, when it comes to storytelling. They're integral to the kinds of stories that I want to be telling, the kind of stories I'm drawn to as a reader as well. And I think hope especially is a particularly pertinent topic at the moment. How do we find the hope? How do we express that hope, especially when we're writing for young people? What is an authentic hope, and what is an authentically hopeful story, and why does that matter? And I think kind of that comes back to why I write YA, why I find YA really interesting to read as well. And that's really because YA is kind of a time of possibility above everything else. There's so much potential in those years in a way that there isn't really at any other point in life. It's the point where the boundaries start changing. You've got more independence, but you're not quite at the stage where you're entirely responsible for your own life. You're not entirely independent, but you're getting there. You're nearly there, and you haven't made the choices that are going to set you in your life. They're still to come. So you have that potential, you have that possibility in front of you. And that's such an interesting time. It's a very frenetic time to experience, but it's a really interesting time to write about, that sense of possibility. So whatever story you're telling, if it's YA, it's never the end. There's always going to be more, and you know that. You know that there's going to be more choices ahead, and you're never stuck. Even if it feels like you're stuck, you're never actually stuck because you've still got your life to come. And I think that's an inherently hopeful thing. I think that's also why a lot of adults are drawn to YA, to kind of remember what that was like, because it's not the same. You don't really get it so much in children's literature, because that has a whole other side of things that makes it appealing to people. But that sense of possibilities is very different in childhood, because you're very protected. You're in your environment. You have that hierarchy of parents and carers. But when you get into your teenage years and you start testing boundaries and making decisions that are going to set you on your path for your life, it's very different. It's such a different time, as I said, from any other time in your life. So I do think it is an inherently hopeful period. And the stories that you tell are kind of infused with that sense of possibility. Even if you're telling sad stories or dark stories, kind of even more so, you don't have to leave people in that sadness. You don't even have to bring them fully out of that sadness in the story. You just have to give that sense that there is more to come. And you're just at a point in your life. You're not trapped in your life, and you're not stuck in your life. So I think it's an important part of storytelling is to have that sense of hope, which is then balanced with the reality of the situation and how people in that moment would feel. Because it's all very well to say, oh, it's a very hopeful time, and you know what, your teenage years, it's inherently hopeful. But of course you don't feel like that at the time. And writing YA is also being true, being authentic to that sense of what's happening having incredible consequences, whether it's fantasy or contemporary like I write, which is real world fiction. You feel at the time that whatever's happening is going to set the course of your entire life, even if it's not. And writing YA as an adult is respecting that feeling, and also the reality of the fact that it probably isn't. It probably is just a part of your life that you will at one point look back on and think, oh, well, that had this effect and this effect and this effect, but it didn't ruin my life. It didn't change my life to the degree that I thought it was going to at the time. And so it's kind of a balance, as with most things. I think for me, the most important rule of storytelling, aside from empathy, is the balance of the light and the dark, and the happy and the sad, and the hope and the despair. And that is because you can't tip the balance too far in one direction, because you lose that sense of understanding of what is to be gained and what is to be lost. So if you can't have an entirely sad book. I know they exist. They're not for me, and I will explain why. Because you care about somebody's sadness because you care more if you know what it is for them to be happy. Because then you understand, or you have a sense of what they've lost, and you care about them getting that back, or getting back to that point in their life. And if you don't have that, if you've only ever seen them sad, you will be sad for them. You will have the empathy for their sadness, but you won't have that sense of, oh, that's what's lost. That's why it's important for them to be happy at some point, because this is what that looks like. And so when you have the balance in a book, and you have your characters having those moments of light and dark, as we all have in life, whatever the situation, there's always some light, there's always some dark. And if you have those in, then you're going to create more compelling characters, more compelling situations, and you're going to have the kind of story that people are emotionally invested in as much as they want to just know what happens. They will start to care for these characters. And that's true the other way around as well. Even though, of course, there are a lot more wholly happy books than there are wholly sad books. The stories that really stay with you, even the happy ones, are ones where there has been sadness within it. And so you've really seen, again, what they have to lose or what they have to gain. So those two things are really important, the light and the dark. Whether you're telling a happy story or a sad story, it doesn't mean you have to do away with the opposite emotion. You understand how they work together to create life, really, and to create the kind of experiences that we remember, not just because of what happened, but because of how we felt. And that kind of is why authenticity is key for me. Writing authentically is what lifts these stories into the emotional territory, away from just the simple what happens. You become invested because of that sense of hope for the characters, but also that feeling of authenticity, which is, I feel like this is real. This is a world that I recognise. These are emotions that I recognise. These are people I could imagine meeting and spending time with. And also you can see yourself, what would I do in this situation? And even if you would do something entirely different, you can still hopefully see why the characters in these different scenarios have made the choices that they've made. And that's because the story and the world around it feels authentic. So, I mean, what does it mean to write authentically? And that's kind of a question I get a lot, especially when it comes to writing stories that are maybe experiences away from stuff that I've experienced or are different in some way. And that's going to be a question that different authors will answer in very different ways. People have a different benchmark for what it takes for them to decide to take on a story or not. For me, it tends to be whether I feel I have a way in. And that will depend on the story or the characters. But if I don't feel like I have a way in of any kind, I won't write the story. And that tends to be different for different books. Some writers will feel comfortable writing books that are and characters that are entirely out of their own experience, and will be confident that the research that they can do will allow them to write the story authentically or in any other way. But for me, there does need to be a little bit more of an emotional way in, more than anything else. So for me, the best example is A Quiet Kind of Thunder, which was my second book. And in A Quiet Kind of Thunder, the protagonist, Steffi, has a severe form of anxiety known as selective mutism, which means that she's unable to talk to people she doesn't know well. And now, I am not a selective mute. I've never had selective mutism. But I have always been shy, and I do have social anxiety, and I had social anxiety as a teenager. So I know a fraction of that experience. I've had moments of that experience. I know how it feels to not be able to speak in front of people for a short period of time or however long. I know I have that feeling. I know what that is. It never happened on the degree of the scale of selective mutism, of course, but it has happened. So I do have a sense of how that would feel. And so what I do is I take those moments and I expand on them, and I try to answer the what ifs that kind of come up. So the obvious one is, well, what if I felt like this all the time? What if I could never speak to people who weren't outside of my inner circle? And what if I experienced this at school? How would that change my schooling? And then how would that affect my life in general? And how would it affect me growing up, and the friends that I made, and the choices, and everything like that? So it just throws up more and more questions, and then you start to begin to answer them, and that's where the characters come from. And so it's that sense of emotional connection with a character, and I definitely had that with Steffi. And so once I have that connection, whatever kind that it is, and I have the subject matter and I have the story, then I will go ahead. I will do a lot of logistical research, but I tend not to do personal research. So that's just a personal choice of mine for how I'm writing. And that's because for me, everybody's story is individual, even if it's a diagnostic criteria of a mental health issue, for example. That doesn't mean that everyone's going to have the same experience, obviously. And it's so influenced by people's own lives and own circumstances. And so I want to create the protagonist's emotional experience entirely from their own life. And so I get that by combining the what ifs and what the character is like, and combine that with the logistical research. And that is usually, I say that's usually enough. That is enough, because if that wasn't enough, I wouldn't write the story. If I didn't feel like it was authentic, and I do tend to have a sense of when it is and when it isn't, then I feel confident enough to go ahead, and I will write the first draft without doing a lot of research, and I will kind of research things as I go, little things, and then once I'm done, I will go and do a lot more research. Sometimes I will go and talk to people, and I'll go back through the draft and kind of bring it all together and adjust things as they need to be adjusted, and incorporate new elements as they've come up. So, for example, when I was writing A Quiet Kind of Thunder, I read a textbook on selective mutism that was written for teachers. So I knew how they would be responding to Steffi and what she would have experienced within the school environment. So I'm not reading a textbook on how Steffi would feel, because nobody knows how Steffi would feel, but except me as the author. But it was important to me to know, well, what would the environment have been like for her? So it's that kind of logistical research. And then you think, well, how would she feel if somebody was talking to her like this? And how would she feel if these were the exercises she had to do in a classroom, and so on and so on. And so the other main character in A Quiet Kind of Thunder is Reese, who is deaf, and he is Steffi's love interest. And this is kind of a good example of whether I have a way in or not, and how I deal with that in my writing. So I have no personal experience of, or a way in to deafness and to deaf culture and to deaf lives. So, which is why I didn't write the story from his perspective. I didn't feel like I could authentically write from the perspective of somebody who is deaf, because I do not know what it's like to be deaf. So instead, I wrote him through Steffi's eyes. The whole book is told from her perspective. And I did a lot of research into every element I could think of on what Reese's life would be like, and how he would be affected by things going on around him, what school would be like. I did an online BSL course, so I could incorporate British Sign Language into the text. Because it was very important to me to be as accurate as possible. Obviously, that should go without saying, but you can't have an authentic story if you don't have an accurate story. So that was always a good place to start. So a lot of the research that I did, probably most of it, isn't actually on the page. It was kind of background for me. I needed to make sure that I was writing a fully fleshed out character, a real person, not just a somebody who, oh well, he is deaf and that's the end. Of course that's not the case. It was needed to be somebody who felt real, and the most important thing, which was to be giving the most accurate representation of a deaf character as possible. So I had 2 what we call sensitivity readers for A Quiet Kind of Thunder, solely for the deaf representation. One of them was an old friend of mine who is deaf, and the other is an acquaintance who is a BSL interpreter. So they were able to kind of look at the story from 2 different perspectives, one from somebody who had a personal experience of it, and one who knew the sign language side of things, so like the logistics of everything. And then they were able to give me their feedback and say, well, this would work slightly differently. You would probably sign this instead of this. So it's the kind of things that I would have no way of knowing. It's the stuff that doesn't come up on Google, for example, because why would it? It's just the everyday of people's lives. And that's why sensitivity readers are particularly valuable, because that's the kind of stuff that they can pick up on. It's not the, well, can you drive a car if you're deaf? It's not that. It's so much more complex than that. It's there's so much more going on, because of course there is. People's lives are complex. And so, for example, there's a scene in A Quiet Kind of Thunder where Steffi and Reese are in the same class, and they're taking notes. I can't even remember now what the class is, but they're taking notes. And in the feedback from one of my sensitivity readers, who was the sign language interpreter, she said, well, actually, that's not how note-taking works if you're deaf, which I didn't know. And she explained, well, this is what the process would be. And so then I was able to edit the scene, so it was correct. And I think that's kind of the key for what it means to try to write authentically. It's most people who read that scene would not know what was accurate and what wasn't. They wouldn't read that and know, because most people don't know what the deaf experience is. And so it would be very easy for a writer to think, well, it doesn't matter, because who really knows? Right? Maybe a handful of people will know it's not right. But as soon as you start to do that, you lose that authenticity, and I think you really lose the right to be writing that story. If you're not trying to honour the experience that people have, why are you doing it, really? You want to be accurate for that percentage of people, however small it is. Those are the people you are trying to get it correct for. Those are the people who will benefit, because everybody else who reads that will, whether they know it's the truth or not, they will assume that you know, and they will take what they're reading as accurate because they trust you, you're the author. And so it is on you, it's your responsibility to make sure that you are being correct and respectful and authentic, because it really does matter. It has, especially with YA, when sometimes if you're writing about particular issues or medical conditions or something like that, it may be, or may well be, the first time somebody reading that has ever encountered that. It may be the first time they're learning about it. And so they're going to believe what you're saying, and they will probably believe it for a very long time. It takes a long time to relearn something you learn, especially if you read it from a book. People really believe things they read in books, they really do. And so you want to make sure that you're not portraying something that is inaccurate. That will then take a long time for them to relearn from other people, who will then have to be very patient and say, well, that's not actually true. And they say, oh, well, I read it in a book. Well, that book's not true. You know, it's just, you can avoid all of that by just getting it correct in the first place. So that's really what I'm trying to do with all my books and whatever I'm writing, is to have that very baseline of accuracy and authenticity. So, I mean, what does that all have to do with hope? Is really the main thing. Why does a book need to be authentic to be hopeful? And I think it's because, for me, writing contemporary YA, which is kind of rooted in real life, it's rooted in the mundane, and it's not fantastical, it's not big rescues or anything like that. So the most important hope that you can put across and write about is the hope in the ordinary, and to find the hope in the everyday and the people that you meet in your school or walking down the street or anywhere you go. It's the quiet hope. So when it comes to writing these stories, you want to be doing that as well. You don't want to have a story that is so rooted in reality and then pull people out of it by giving them an unrealistic idea of what hope is, because they're experiencing this in real life. So nobody's going to flick a switch and take that problem away. And when you're writing contemporary YA, I think you really have to accept that. You really have to understand what that means. There isn't going to be a fix. And if you are showing people in your book that there is a quick fix, people who have experienced that know that's not true. Even if they want it to be true, they know it isn't. And so I feel like you are doing a disservice to everybody who has experienced this real world problem by telling them, oh, well, in this book, it got fixed like that. Because that's unfair. I think that's part of your contract as an author with the reader, is to not do that. So you don't want there to be any unrealistic rescue. So I mean, the most obvious example is if you take a character who is maybe has a suicidal ideation, which unfortunately happens, and there are people with a suicidal ideation. It's a very difficult thing to talk about. It's a very difficult thing to write about. It's something that if you are going to write about, you have to be very responsible, you have to be very careful, you have to be very understanding of the reality of that. And what you're not going to do is have that character meet somebody, say a love interest, who is going to sweep them off their feet and fall in love with them and fix them. And then at the end of the story, the character is, well, I don't have a suicidal ideation anymore because this person loves me. Because that's not what happens, unfortunately. That's not how life is. It's not a great message to be giving young people. Well, it doesn't matter what your problem is, you just have to wait for somebody to come in and rescue you. Because life and adulthood and growing into adulthood, which is really what teenage years are about and what YA is about, is realising that no one is coming to save you, which can feel like a really scary thing when you're growing up and you start to learn that adults don't have all the answers, your parents don't have all the answers, and there's not a fix for everything. And actually, it's actually on you to find ways through and to find solutions or anything that it takes to kind of deal with whatever issue that you're dealing with. But it doesn't have to be frightening, because what it's really about is finding that trust in yourself and that strength in yourself and coming to know yourself, setting your own boundaries, choosing the people who are going to be in your life, whether that includes blood family or not, it doesn't always, and ultimately deciding what you want your life to be. Those are really important things. They're going to be the choices that make your life, and letting go of that idea that there is some great rescuer on its way. It means you're able to kind of take control of your decisions and your life and your own choices, which is a really important thing. It's a really empowering thing. It's a really mature thing. And so I don't think it's a bad thing to say that there aren't rescuers on their way, and there's not going to be a boy who's going to come and love all your problems away. It's understanding that you don't need somebody else. It is actually in you as much as anything else. And that's kind of true for the world as well. Like, we can't just wait for the problems to be fixed. We have to fix them ourselves. And understanding that and accepting that is a really important step on the way to actually fixing these problems. And that's why authenticity is such an important part of a hopeful book, because it's rooted in real life. It's speaking to the truth of the experience. It's not offering an unrealistic solution to a realistic problem. And if you can read all of that and you can see it all happening in real life and you can see the small hope at the end, you can also perhaps find that in your own life, which I think is a really important thing. You're not just reading it and thinking it's entirely separate. You can see the reflections of it in your own life. And that is what I'm hoping for with all of my books. It's that sense of the real, and the sense of hope in the real as well. and there are no easy answers, but there are a lot of people who love you, there are a lot of people who are willing to help, and understanding how to navigate the scary world is going to be a lot easier with these people around you. And so with that in mind, I'm going to do a very quick reading, and I was trying to think of the best reading I could do that would kind of sum up everything I talked about, and what and I was thinking, well, which is my most hopeful book, and what's the most hopeful bit of all my books, and I kept coming back to the epilogue of Fierce Fragile Heart. And now I would never usually give a reading from the end of one of my books, but I think in this case none of the other books really captured that feeling that I have, and why I think hope is so important as Fierce Fragile Hearts. So I don't think it really counts as a spoiler, I will say that now. I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end of the book, it's just that it's that sense of feeling that comes across. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that Fierce Fragile Hearts ends on a hopeful note. I would think that anybody reading it would maybe not expect that, but would be pleased to know that it ends that way. It doesn't end on a really depressing note. So I am going to do a quick reading from the very end of Fierce Fragile Hearts. And so this is Suzanne, who is the protagonist of Fierce Fragile Hearts. She was a character in Beautiful Broken Things, which was narrated by a different protagonist, Caddy. And Fierce Fragile Hearts follows Suzanne as after she's left the care system to live independently. And hope is something she really needs. It's something that she struggles with. And Fierce Fragile Hearts is really about her journey to finding that hope. And so at the end, she is at a barbecue with her friends, and she is talking about the tattoo that she just got. The arrow, about the size of my index finger, points up near the top of my spine. I spent so long staring at the design that I know it by heart, even though it's on a piece of my body I can't see. Sometimes, when I have my low moments, God, I still get my low moments, I think of that arrow, pointing constantly, solidly, up. Whatever is going on in my life, however close I get to rock bottom, whatever the situation, there's a path for me that will always be looking up. It helps somehow. I got the tattoo 3 years to the day since my last suicide attempt. I didn't tell anyone the significance of the date, and if anyone figured it out, they didn't say so. As the needle seared against my skin, I closed my eyes and thought of all the days I'd had since then, the days I thought I hadn't wanted or deserved. Southampton and Christie and Don, Ventrella Road and Dillis, Clarence, Kel in his open house, Sara, seeing Caddy wearing a University of Warwick hoodie, her bright coppery hair, watching Rosie hold hands with Jade, her smile wide, Matt. There have been so many times in my life that I thought I was starting again, whether I wanted to or not. I thought that was what I had to do to finally get a chance to make things right. But that's not how it works, I get that now. Recovering isn't about fresh starts or new beginnings. It's about the constant as well as the change. You build a foundation in layers, and that's what makes it strong. Maybe sometimes it means taking a step back, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Sometimes you have to take a step back to get a better view of where you're going. I will never be better, because better is not a thing. I will always just be me, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's even great. I'm sitting in my garden with my dog on my lap, an arrow on my back that will always point up, and I'm surrounded by people who love me. Yeah, I'm doing just fine. And that is how Fierce Fragile Hearts ends. So I hope that wasn't too much of a spoiler for anybody. And that really kind of encompasses how I feel, what I would want the message to be for my books, which is hope, hope for better times and hope in yourself. And that's kind of what I wish for the world as well at the moment. I think most people would and do, to kind of leave the room for the hope, and that things will be better and that we can make things better for each other. Thank you very much. I hope this was interesting for people. I'm sorry about the light changing. I am obviously kind of at the mercy of the sun and the clouds. I've never given a talk like this before, so I hope it worked for people. But thank you very much. Thank you.